Greetings, everyone. Thanks for coming out to another Brony Debates Live. I hope you are all doing well out there. Today, we've got a pretty interesting topic. My friend SazerLite here, and sponsor of the videos, suggested that we talk about idealism versus realism in fiction.
Greetings, everyone. Thanks for
We're gonna have him define those terms in a second there. But, since we're going to be talking about fiction and writing, I had to bring on some other writers. So, the first name that usually comes to my head when I get suggested something like this is author of the Ponyfinder books. You've seen him at every convention that you've ever been to, Mr. David Silver. How are you doing today?
Oh, Internet. I'm disappointed because I didn't get to write today. What's up with that?
Oh, geez. Heaven forbid you took the day off, you freaking workaholic.
What? No, FiMfiction down.
But yeah, so you're doing all right then?
Other than FiMfiction being down, I am okay.
Yes, that's right. It's been down all day, which is a darn shame because I've had time to read.
Really? I had time to write.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, internal server error.
Yep. And that voice is returning, this time in a debating capacity rather than a gaming capacity, is SashaLace, the guy behind all of the music that I've done on my channel. How are you doing tonight, Sasha?
Doing good. Happy to be here and, once again, chime in on your thoughts and opinions on anything and everything,
Yep, sounds good. And, of course, we got the gentleman who suggested tonight's topic, Mr. SazerLite. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing pretty good today.
Cool. Now, before we get into it, I just got to give a quick shout-out to all of my very generous supporters on Patreon, who make my continued content creation in these live streams possible, make it much easier for me to pay my bills. I'm especially grateful to the folks on the $10 and up tier. This increasingly long list featuring Princess Heather Blossom, Shady Oak Ministries, Sid McConroy, Autoknight, Emerald Spencer, Sodden, Girder, Senko, Jennan, Kellogg, Kyle Christensen, DJ Skywalker, Stephen A. Wilson, Reck, Rein-Kun, and the Equestrian City Heroverse series. Most of those guys have their own content. It's all linked in the description. Please check them out. If you'd like to get on the show, I'd love to have you on. We just need you to get onto the Patreon for as little as $1 a month, and from there, you can make suggestions for topics, make suggestions for games, and get in the rotation to get on my shows. With all that being said, let's get on to the show itself. So, SazerLite, do me a favor and define your terms for me. So, your suggestion was idealism versus realism in fiction. I'm not quoting you exactly there, but it was something along those lines up on Twitter. Can you go into further detail for us?
I will fully admit I kind of waffled myself with this a little bit, thinking should it be realism versus escapism, or should it be idealism versus realism, or something like that. I think this is the best one because they are more contradictory. Now, what I'm talking about is you listen to a story, you watch a story, you watch a show, you watch a movie or play a game or whatever, and something may happen that is the most optimal, ideal outcome. What I mean ideal is something happens that is not necessarily realistic, but it is something we should strive for. It is what we should look up to as the golden standard for our real lives. Realism is supposed to be more of a reminder, more of this is what it's actually like here, in IRL living. Now, do you want me to list off like a couple examples?
Oh, certainly.
When it comes to MLP, for example, Friendship's Magic, the thing I immediately go to when it comes to idealism is, of course, the forgiveness of Starlight Glimmer, and everyone, a lot of people criticize that because that's not realistic. That's not what should happen. That's not what should happen. Now, the reason why people are against that is because, well, what's to stop her from just doing evil things again? Well, ideally, she has learned her lesson, and she really truly does have no ill intentions to do bad things again. But of course, realistically, we don't know that for certain. We have to be suspicious. We have to be untrusting of those who have. We should be more cautious to those who have wronged us in the past, because who's to say their intentions are good? Now, when it comes to realism, one episode that always stands out to me when it comes to this is what's it called? Flutter Brother. The episode with what's his name? Zephyr Breeze.
Zephyr Breeze.
Yes. A lot of people were really uncomfortable watching that episode because, in many respects, it was a little too real. It felt it reminded them too much of what their real lives are.
We all know at least one Zephyr Breeze.
Yeah, I know, and a lot of fans didn't like that because it felt like I came to the show to escape reality and this kind of taps into my idea of escapism. People come to the show to be relieved of their real life, but episodes like that just remind them of it, and they don't like that. But is there a place for that? I truly believe there is a time and place for everything.
I am raising a hoof.
All right.
Behold.
I've talked enough. Let's hear what you guys think.
Yeah, what do you have to say about that, David?
Okay, so I will say that episode in particular was actually idealistic and a bit realistic altogether. The problem that set people off was, yes, it definitely had the realistic part with the fact that everybody knows a Zephyr Breeze. Everybody understands what that is, and all too many people have had to deal with that kind of situation. But there was a strong idealistic streak in how they dealt with him. And they kind of had they had their happy ending. Everything was basically worked out by the time that they got through with it. Was he made into a perfect person? No, but at least he was on the right path. And everybody got a happy ending. Yay! Roll credits. My Little Pony. To put it bluntly, at least specifically with MLP is an idealistic show.
No arguments.
In many ways, yes, it is a very.
I mean, just in terms of its overall tone, it's an idealistic show.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is. The lessons it teaches are truly what we, mankind, should strive to be.
But
also, just how they approach things, how things get in their way. It's all very ideal, mythological. We're not getting bothered by realism because that takes too much time. And that's not our age demographic, so we're not going to care about it.
I have some disagreements there, but I don't want to get into them quite yet. Sasha, do you have anything to say to what's been said so far?
Idealism versus realism is kind of like an endless pursuit.
Yeah, I kind of apologize for this topic because it is very nebulous.
Well, don't apologize. That just means we got plenty to run with, and I'm sure once we really get into the meat and potatoes here, we'll have some pretty interesting discussion. So, what do you mean by endless journey?
Well, I mean, in my time writing and in my time editing for other people, one thing I always saw a lot of writers struggle with is the balance. Because, when you're writing realistic fiction, there's still elements of idealism. You can't really write something that's totally realistic unless you're going to just straight up write a documentary on someone. But you also can't just straight up write idealism until you go into fantasy, say that you're not fantasy when you are. You always kind of need the other in one way or the other, no matter how far you lean into one. Because think of it this way. Saving Private Ryan is kind of like a perfect example. Yes, it's not exactly like a super accurate movie, but it's still realistic because it's real people in real situations, but also takes the idealisms of war, the idealisms of us as people trying not to go crazy through a bad situation. Some of the parts that people call boring are actually really the most important parts of the movie, and they're there so that you're not just feeling depressed the entire movie. The truth is, when we watch something realistic, we're not trying to be depressed unless it's a documentary, right? And when we watch something that's very fantastical, like Harry Potter, there's still an element of grounding to it. Like, yes, it's fantasy, but there's still there's still a dynamic to it. It's not just all these fantastical heights and no lows. The lows are just as bad as the highs, and in reverse, obviously, but I just think that you kind of need both, and you can't really lean into one or the other unless you're going to willingly subject an entire audience to whatever you're feeling and be an all persona.
Let me ask you this, Sasha, because it sounds like you're conflating idealism and realism with a negative tone and a positive tone. Given what you said,
I'm going by general. I'm just speaking in generality. Like, realism can be positive, but more often than not, it's, kind of middle of the road. And idealism can either be really positive or very neutral too. I'm just speaking from a place of general. I should have tried not to sound so good, bad, but it's not a bad thing to write in either direction, if you ask me.
All right,
May I approach that?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, because I actually felt pretty much the same thing you did there with the kind of positive and negative, because you can be writing what it would be an idealistic story, but have really sharp lows and still be idealistic, still be super idealistic. In fact, let's go back to the Pony Show. It's one of our favorite things, right?
Yeah, it's my favorite thing anyway.
That show is, as I said, very shiningly idealistic. That's just kind of the tone that it has. But while we were dealing with StarLite, hey, we brought her up. We get to bring her up again. When we were going through the possible futures, there were some pretty dark futures there. But it didn't stop being idealistic. It certainly did get more realistic when you put time travel into it.
Nope.
No, it was still super idealistic, but negative.
Mm-hmm. So would that be more like a worst case scenario then?
Well, the way I see it, the difference between idealism and realism is how much you get away from what is known fact. And you're always going to get away a little bit from what is known fact unless you're writing nonfiction, in which case I think we just lost the whole topic. So, but if you just gently brush off of it, then you end up with something that's very realistic. Whereas when you shove against it and leave the world behind, now you're in ideal land.
Interesting. Sazer, what do you think?
I mostly agree with what you guys have said. For me, I'm not thinking so much about, in terms of fantasy or real life or whatever. And that's saying I think more in terms of interpersonal connections, like for in terms of how situations are handled, idealistic versus realistic. For example, back to MLP, in the episode, I think it was called was it A Matter of Principles? Was that the episode in which Discord, messed with the school and everything, and Starlight tried to get him to stop and everything? In the end, despite all of his, shenanigans, Starlight, apologizes to him for not giving him a chance to become what's the term, a teacher, to be part of the school. Now, that is not really realistic at all. Like, that really should not happen.
Yeah, because that episode really pissed me off because it was rewarding Discord's behavior.
Yeah, so that's a kind of an episode in which you kind of needed to be more realistic, because realistically, if someone were to do that at any school or any public area, you'd get in trouble, and there is no going around that, except to change your behavior.
Well, these are the extremes that you tend to sometimes see, and that happens in honestly any medium. Sometimes the balance isn't really struck in either A, they don't care because my vision, or B, they just don't spot these things, or just it doesn't stand out to them,
Yeah, someone dropped the ball hard on quite a few episodes. Like, in fact, I would dare say most of the school-centered episodes in season 8 were just absolutely screwed. Sometimes even regressions of the characters, and me sitting there having been a former teacher myself, going, no, that's not how it works. So I don't know if it was just if it was bad writing, or if if a good script was made and then it was sent off to corporate and corporate said, no, we want it to go like this because corporate has no idea what they're doing. It could have been any number of things along that spectrum. But what we ended up getting was, Twilight completely missing the point of being an experience-based teacher, which baffled me because she was shown being an experience-based teacher in season 4. Applejack and Rainbow Dash completely forgetting what they're supposed to be about. Starlight rewarding Discord's behavior, just a whole bunch of stuff that really...
Ronnie.
Yeah.
Yeah, you are totally correct in having these various opinions, but I feel like we're getting off topic.
Yes, so that's a very long-winded... I apologize. That is on me. Went off on a tangent. Very long-winded way of saying that was somebody's ideal that wasn't very realistic, and it took away from the episode.
Yeah, I guess that brings up that just adds to the question: when is ideal dangerous? When is it wrong?
Mm-hmm. So here's a thing, because there are limits based on the medium. For instance, if I was writing a fanfic and I was writing that episode, but in a story with words, yay words, I would have Starlight be a little more angry and upset, and she would need to think through and reach a place where she could even attempt to do something with Discord, and Discord would need to come around on his side, as opposed to everybody just snapping into position, which is really convenient when you need things to wrap up in 30 minutes.
Well, I mean, that's just one of the biggest pitfalls that I think that even outside of the show, I've seen a lot of fanfics. A lot of fanfic writers probably started because of the show to fanfic write, which is great. But convenient storytelling is one of the things that will happily and very quickly kill the balance between idealism and realism.
Mm-hmm. So here's a question I wanted to ask everybody.
Yeah.
Which of the two do we think is better between the two concepts? Like, when you get into fiction, and treat this question very subjectively. When you sit down to read something, or you sit down to watch a movie or a TV show, whatever, and there's a story to be ingested, do you prefer realism or do you prefer idealism? Sasha?
That's kind of tough because it really depends on my mood, but if I had to really pick one, I've always been a very big fan of idealistic situations, but not just a touch of realism, but grounded more in it than not.
Okay, can you elaborate that at all? Because I'm having trouble picturing what you're saying.
Have you seen The Last of Us, the first game, or heard of it?
I know it's a zombie survival game.
Not quite zombies, but it's a survival horror kind of game, and it's based on the idealistic view that what if fungi became the fall of mankind, and you're playing through this world where you're starting to see nature start to reclaim things, and some of the only standing cities are kind of like the bastion of humanity. That's super idealistic. But it's grounded pretty heavily with realism because of this context of the story. You have two people going on a journey, trying to figure out if where they're going to in the end is actually going to legitimately save humanity, or whether they're just being diluted by people that are trying so hard to hold on to just the scraps of an old world that's gone. That's a very, for me, I found the story to be really enjoyable just on that notion alone. It took its idealisms and ran with them, but it also constantly, in terms of like writing, you can tell that they were checking themselves and making sure that these characters were reacting in a way that's believable, that they're not just rolling with it, because unless they've been used to this world, like some of the characters you meet were born sometime after the fall of humanity. A lot of people at this point, not quite so much, but you see the difference, the stark difference between the people that have suffered through this world and the people that are still naive and hoping that humanity can still rebuild. It's the kind of balance that is hard to hit, but for me, that's the kind of balance I personally enjoy.
Alrighty then. David, what do you prefer?
Okay, I mean, I'm actually not that terribly far off. I prefer fiction that gives me a fantastical, idealized starting point, but then keeps its characters and the reactions to the situations grounded in reality. I don't like things to be solved because that's the way it has to be resolved. I don't feel like good wins because it's good is a good way to do it, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I want good to win because it has better strategy. Or plus 10 sword, and the bad guy only has a plus 8. Well, he's screwed. Ha 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 ha.
Alrighty then. So then what separates the good and the evil for you then?
Now that depends a lot on how idealistic the entire world is. The more idealistic the world is, the more likely you are to have a very clear cut. This is the good guy, and this is the bad guy. You should have no feelings for that one.
So real quick, how do you feel about stories with no heroes? Say, for example, like something like The Boys. Are you familiar with that one?
That is not. No.
Okay, so
sorry.
So stories where characters may or may not have a redeeming quality or two, but by and large there are no true heroes and everybody's just a horrible person to each other.
See, well, no, I don't like that. I'm totally cool with a story where there's a bunch of people just trying to survive, and they're not particularly good, but they're not jerks, they're just people, and they're trying to make do. And sometimes that goes well, and sometimes it doesn't go well, but nobody's like actively out to hurt each other, because that's also not realistic either.
Alrighty then, and Sazer, how about you? What do you prefer?
Well, I kind of said in the beginning of this stream that every there's a time and place for everything.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it kind of depends on my mood, because there are times in which I just want to turn off my brain and just have a good time. And there are times in which I want something that really could help me see what, be better prepared for what's real and or more challenging in life.
So it sounds like we're all sort of in the middle on this, because I can very quickly say I prefer, I like realistic stories and I like fantasy-based stories, but the most important thing to me is characters that I can relate to. So it sounds like we're all in agreement there. Am I wrong?
Well, here's a question I'm going to throw out there, because right now we're speaking in very broad terms.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go with characters. Do you prefer idealistic characters or realistic characters?
So what's an idealistic character?
Let's say an idealistic character is the noble knight who does good because that's what he was told, and he is just going to do good because that is the way he was raised to be, and by golly, that's just the way it is. And he goes off and he does good things because good is always better than bad, and come on. And he never really thinks about it too much harder than that. I'm going to twist it around and bring it back to our pony show, because the pony show has a lot of kind of idealistic characters in that they have a right and wrong, and those matters are not really challenged very much except for when it comes to like little flaws in their character. But for the most part, they have a pretty good grasp of what is right and what is wrong, and that's not really changing.
Mm-hmm.
They are ideal character. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I see what you mean. I don't know if I agree 100%, but I do see what you mean.
Well, then what part would you disagree with?
If we're going to talk about the main six, let's be honest here. Characters like Rainbow Dash don't have the best view of what's right and wrong.
Oh, I didn't say they were correct. At no point.
Mm-hmm. But
you can have an idealistic bad guy.
Right.
Some of the best
He's
bad guys.
Not right.
Some of the best villains are idealistic.
Oh heck yeah!
You know, when they get caught up in usually the crossing of the threshold starts at the point where they say something along the lines of no matter the cost. Am I wrong?
Skeletor.
Well, yeah, that's more of a real people don't act like that.
Well, I'm just saying he is an example of an idealistic bad guy.
Mm-hmm.
He is bad because he just likes being bad, and you're not going to really change his mind. That's
some
not
men
happening.
just want to watch the world burn.
Yeah, he falls under that camp. But yeah, he's a good example of an idealistic bad guy. Ideal does not mean good.
Mm-hmm. Sasha, I haven't heard from you in a bit. What do you think? I think we lost him.
Oh, no.
I don't think he's lost. I just think
I'm
he
still
doesn't know what to say.
I was just trying to fix something in my room.
Oh, okay.
Oh, I didn't have my headphones on. What did I miss? I'm sorry.
Oh my gosh, man.
Literally, I was what a sleeping
You
mic.
can't do that to us.
So we were talking about idealistic characters and what makes an idealistic character, because I had said that I like that I don't care if a setting is realistic or fantasy based, but I need realistic characters. And then we went back and forth on that a little bit, and I haven't heard you say anything to that regard. And I said, okay, an example of an idealistic character is somebody who gets wrapped up in their own morals. Usually a villain will say something along the lines of no matter the cost, and that's usually when they turn into an idealistic. And then David countered with an example like Skeletor, or maybe like something like Cobra Commander, something very 1980s where just nobody ever acts like that in real life. So you're up to speed now. What do you think?
I've never been a fan of idealistic villains. They always strike me as just, frankly, like, really, that's all you're upset about?
Okay. This is something that's actually modern, and now checking for spoilers. Can I talk about the new She-Ra?
Do it.
I haven't seen it, but go ahead.
Oh, no.
I haven't seen it either,
I
but I don't
really care about spoilers.
Okay. Well, they have a villain in it, Catra. You've at least probably heard of her. Just from the internet. No? Yes, maybe?
Yeah, I know that. Yeah. Just go into it. Tell us what you think.
Okay. Well, see, the interesting thing about her is they give the veneer of an idealistic villain to start with. I'm bad because I was trained to be bad, and I like being bad. Bad's cool, yo. And as the story goes along, we get more and more fragments of her character, and her view on life gets more and more complicated. And then it seems to slam viciously back into the idealistic territory, where she becomes like what appears to be just like a pure bad guy, pure villain.
Mm.
But then they pull it back again. That's a good show. I'm just putting it out there, okay?
All right.
I really liked it. If you didn't see it, go see it. But they managed to pull her back into realism, basically towards the end, and really made it work. Oh my god, it was good. But I'm saying one of the most important things in my head about idealism versus realism in fiction is keeping it in mind and knowing the difference and being aware of it as a writer. that makes sense.
Okay, so, give us some more details on that.
Oh God. Fine, I see how it is. Shoot, I've written too many things. Now I have to think of an example. God damn it. Okay. I have had stories. I had a story where Dr. Hooves was actually a were-human. Oh no.
Oh, I remember that one.
Oh, you did read that one.
Mm-hmm.
Nice. And for a good portion of that story, he had an idealistic villain chasing him around, dead set on capturing him and putting an end to all the shenanigans. But then it does manage to kind of blossom towards the end when everybody on either side realizes, wait, we don't have to be exactly diametrically opposed on this, and we get a nice little expansion into realism as opinions become a bit less two-dimensional, if that makes sense.
I suppose.
And you read the story. You were there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that makes sense. And that's a good segue into another question I wanted to ask all of us. Where exactly is the balance in when a story should be realistic versus idealistic? SazerLite, do you have any opinions on that?
It is a very tough balance to bring because I'm so shocked I didn't think of this sooner, but in terms of ideal characters, one that really stood out that started ideal but then became more realistic is Princess Celestia.
Okay.
She, for the longest time, she was looked at as sort of this high standard. She's the princess. She raises the sun. She is benevolent to all her subjects. But starting in, I think, like season 7 onward, they really tried to, I guess, for a lack of a better term, humanize her more. And I've heard some people, I believe it was the Second Opinion that said this, was not really on board with that. And he kind of liked her as being the ideal princess and was not fully on board with her being more realistic, more relatable, if you will.
I actually disagree with his viewpoint on that. I I prefer a leader who, while on the surface appears perfect, is not infallible. Because think about it like this, if she was always the ideal, there would be no reason for the show to end how it ended then.
I still must object just on facts, because your friend is wrong. And on the internet, if somebody's wrong, I have to prove it.
All right, prove it then.
Oh boy.
Season 1, episode 22, A Bird in the Hoof. Princess Celestia is being served tea by the Cakes. And they are very nervous and trying to treat...
She trolls the heck out of them.
She trolls the heck out of them. She was never a perfect princess, even back in season 1.
That was just more or less what everybody, the main characters, and by extension, a good chunk of the audience, myself included, thought.
Oh yes, the world sees her as a super idealistic person, but she never was.
Mm-hmm.
Which is a really cool, actually, like little gotcha kind of thing. Even way past that, people still think that she was perfect. It's like, no, she isn't. She proved that she isn't. No, she's perfect. Okay.
I mean, she'd be perfect to you.
Yeah. So what do you think about that then, Sasha?
I really agree with that assessment about her. She was never a perfect character. I mean, that's just the subtlety of writing. You can write a character that looks one way but is the other. I mean, some of the best villains can be written that way. I mean, for example, I really loved The Dark Knight. Like, the contrast between Batman and Joker was excellently captured. And you understand where each of them are coming from. But had they just evolved it into good versus bad, and there's no shades of gray, it would just be another bog standard action flick. You have to have nuance. You have to have nuance. Otherwise, you're just writing caricatures, and you're not writing characters.
I completely agree with that. Idealism really does not have a good place in the conflict.
Yeah, it doesn't, because let's be real here. Virtually almost all world leaders, both past and present, are by no means idealistic. Like, some of them we do look up to, but
in theory, anybody can be idealistic.
Yeah, but I don't think any of them could hold the candle to someone like Celestia, who has a very great, very solid foundation of what is right and what is good.
And usually in the real world, when people idealize their human leaders, you get something like North Korea. It's not a good thing.
I mean, that was.
I'm gonna slide a bit here. Slide into the stories that came before our stories. Myths.
All right, let's hear it.
Myths, if you look back at them, although they are often kind of touted as the kind of source of idealism, the conflicts were very rarely good versus evil.
They were one god wants to do one thing and the other god doesn't want him to do it, or it wants to do something else, and they fight with each other for the right to have their way.
Or, a god leans over, pushing their cloud out of the way. Hey, you, mortal. Me? Yeah, you, the one that's breathing. Oh, I'm going to mess with you. Could you not? No, I'm doing it. Oh, damn it.
No, that's pretty accurate. That's most of Greek mythology, if I remember correctly.
Yes. Very much. And there are lots of mythological stories where you had one supernatural animal, possibly a god, sometimes not, who is just at odds with another supernatural animal and or god. And they both just want their thing, and it's not even, half the time, it's not even like a super important thing, but they both want it. And neither of them is really the bad guy, but they both want it, which makes them at odds. That makes sense?
Gosh darn it, they're both going to get what they want.
Like almost every story that has Coyote in it. He wants something, but it's something that you have, and you don't want him to have it, but he really wants it. And in come the shenanigans where he tries to get it. He's not necessarily like a super bad guy for trying to go for it, but he might be being a little naughty.
So how does that play into what we're talking about here?
That's a callback to reframing idealism versus realism, because I think sometimes people get confused with the more modern idealistic tales, especially when you get down to the conflict. Because conflict should never just be ideal. It should never just be, here is a person who has a choice between a right thing to do and a wrong thing to do. Boy, I hope they pick the right thing.
I've always been more of a fan of stories that don't try to just define everything so binary. Good, bad, yes, no. Like, there is room to barter, And I think an example of it is, I don't like particularly when games that aren't RPGs try to involve the elements of an RPG while still ignoring the fact that an RPG boils down to a game about choice. But you're giving me binary choices that don't change or even really mean anything. You're just adding a button prompt to make sure that I'm awake.
That dude stole my sweet roll. Do you want to A, let him have it and do nothing, or B, stab him and his whole family?
Choose C. Call the dragons.
I guess when you really boil it down to it, the topic of idealism versus realism, in my view anyway, is simply the question: what would happen versus what should happen. Idealism being should, realism being would.
So I got two more questions here that I wanna ask everybody. The first one I want to ask is: are there any? What are the pros and cons to idealism and realism, respectively? Sasha, let's start with you.
run that by me again. I want to make sure that I'm actually like.
Give me the pros and cons of idealism and realism within fiction. What are the potential benefits, and how could each concept go very wrong?
I mean, to start with idealism, one of the biggest benefits with idealism is you are more able to kind of be omniscient from a writer's perspective in controlling, the plot. That's why people who kind of get annoyed at idealism call it just plot convenience, because if you're not careful with it, again, there's that balance. If you're not careful, when you go too hard with idealism, it just comes off as though the story has to go in this direction because you as the writer said so. So that's kind of a negative right there of idealism, but idealism gives you room to have amazing places to go, amazing adventures, allows you to set up stakes that are probably bigger than life. That's the excitement of idealism. Is something that I really appreciate about it, but the negative for me has always kind of been if there's nothing to ground to it, even if it's not realism, like you can have an idealistic comedy, and those are grounded by the comedy as a reminder that, the things may be larger than life, but it's still, fiction. There's still something to hold all the narrative thread together, and if you don't really pair it with something that complements the story, you just end up with something that just feels so fantastical and unrelatable.
All right. David, what do you think?
I was hoping I get picked next. I say that idealism gives you a very solid and easily relatable starting point. If you have an idealistic character, if you have an idealistic world, you have an idealistic nation, each of these things is really easy to take in, absorb, and you sort of nod and go, okay, I know what that is. It is this. And then you can expand from there. If you stay in ideal land forever, then you're just dealing in stereotypes, you're dealing in, archetypes. You can't have a whole story that's nothing but an archetype. People have to grow a little bit beyond that, but they make a great starting point. You can very quickly tell people what ideal every particular thing is, and then divert from there. But don't soak in it. It's like the little kiddie's pool, and if you hang out there forever, everybody laughs at you.
Well, that gets into the difference of cliche, versus tropes, where cliche tends to have the word cliche tends to have more of a negative connotation because everything is done and there's really only so many different types of people out there. So if all you have is the ideal, then it might not be realistic. You start running into these problems. I don't know if that makes any sense. Sazer, what do you think?
The pros and cons. Well, as we've alluded to earlier, one of the major cons to idealism is the fact that, well, it can't be as applied to real life as realism is. You don't learn. You're not as likely to learn from it, or it could give off a bad message. I guess for a slight example, Princess Luna in Princess's Dream of Magic Sheep got over her, self-hatred really quickly, and most people can criticize that episode for not being realistic. And some people see that as potentially dangerous lesson for kids. So I think that's the con of that. The pro for idealism is, of course, something you want to look up to. I believe that mankind in general should look up to something to strive towards. And if they have nothing, then you just become complacent. The cons of realism is, well, I guess the most simple way to put it would be you become overly cynical and you no longer see hope in anyone. You become overly jaded. But the upside is, of course, well, you're better prepared. You have a better idea of how things work and what to do when certain conflicts arise.
Well, there's
you're conflating that idealism from optimism thing again.
Yeah, I know. I mean, when I hear the word idealism, I think the gold standard. I think what the perfect outcome of something.
Well, see, that's the thing. It is the perfect example, but it could also be the perfect example of something you don't want.
I suppose.
Realistic doesn't always mean bad either. You know, I could realistically portray a sunny day where, you know, I go outside and it's the perfect temperature, and, you know, my skin absorbs that vitamin D, and my serotonin gets boosted by the natural sunlight, and I sleep really well later that night. But it would be just as realistic to portray to then wake up the next morning with a horrible sunburn.
Well, here's the thing. I could talk about like a really good teacher who does the teaching thing all day. That could be a whole story of this teacher doing teaching and doing a good job of it. They're a good person, and it's a totally realistic story. It has no idealism here, but it's not bad. It's actually pretty nice. It's just the teacher teaching things.
And I would say that the pros of idealism and realism both lie within their balance. What kind of story are you trying to tell? What kind of message are you trying to deliver? Is there a moral?
Oh, yeah.
And how applicable is that moral? That's where you want to have ideals that, you know, things might not work out this way in reality always, but they certainly can, and sometimes they do. And if you do all the right things, you might be able to replicate it as well. You know, at the end of every moral of the story video, I say that. Then I say something along the lines of, if we do like they did here, then we can do it. Then we can do the same thing too, which is perfectly realistic with a touch of idealism. And I think that's the most healthy way to go about it. So that applies to both idealism and realism, because you also want to make sure people know exactly what they're getting into, so they don't give themselves, you know, a false state of security where when they get hit with the harsh reality and it's like, oh shoot, this is actually impossible, and they get discouraged, or I got lied to or something like that. But you also, you know, you don't want to make the ideal too difficult to achieve, whereas the cons of both idealism and realism lay within their extremes, where realism can in itself be discouraging. You know, and to give a real life example of this is my family often calls me a pessimist. I don't believe I'm a pessimist at all. In fact, you know, and I tend to be one of the more creative problem solvers that I know when faced with an issue. But that's because I try to look at things as objectively as possible. But when I explain what's, you know, to my family, what's going on in my life and why I'm having so much trouble with certain things, they call me a pessimist. And I said, no, it's not that I'm pessimist, it's that it sucks. And this is what I'm dealing with. And they just can't wrap their heads around that. Where if, on the other side of the spectrum, idealism can pretty much just end up being sunshine and rainbows all the time, and you never get any sort of real sense of conflict, so you have nothing to overcome. You never get stronger. And you have no real way to gauge reality. It's just no way to learn. And then, you know, so I see the pros and cons of these concepts as what the audience can take away from it. Unless it's just supposed to be stupid, mindless comedy or, you know, fun for the sake of fun, I have no problem with that as well. In which case, you know, I might even want something a little more realistic rather than a happy ending every time. There's merit in that too. So that's all I have to say to that. Does anybody want to rebuke me at all?
Well, I mean, as a habit, I love rebuking you, but
No, it's okay. So if there's nothing to say there, and my second question was going to be, how can we better implement these pros and cons? But I think in the answers that you gave me, we've already answered that question. So what I'd like to do now, if there's no objections, is move on to the audience participation segment of the panel. So
I actually wanted to bring up something the audience was talking about.
All right, yeah. So we'll get to that in just a second. If this is your first time watching us, what we do now is I've been watching the stream, and apparently Sasha and David have also been watching the stream and seeing you guys chat.
Me too.
Yep. Well, good job, Sazer. Thank you very much. And we've been taking note of the things you've said. So if you've been asking a question or making an interesting comment, we're going to address those now. If you have any more questions, feel free to answer them, and we'll try to get to them. So let's actually start with David. What did you want to talk about, David?
Hi. Okay, I saw people talking about Saitama, otherwise known as One Punch Man.
Okay, the parody. That's an interesting thing to talk about. Let's hear it.
He is an extremely idealistic character. He has become so idealistic that his life has become a joke unto itself. He is the punchline. He doesn't like the joke. All he wanted was to get into awesome fights with bad guys. And unfortunately, his training went a bit too far, and now he's super strong, and now he punches for everything just once, and they're down. He can't have a good fight anymore. And his entire struggle is the struggle against idealism, which is kind of amazingly on point for this conversation. Surrounding him, like he has his little android buddy, who is somewhat idealistic in personality, as opposed to Saitama, who is super not idealistic in personality. He is, in fact, has a super realistic, almost dull personality, One Punch Man. But the robot cyborg is completely 100% idealistic personality, but is constantly running into the problems of realistic limitations to his power. So he can't always win, and he gets beat up a lot. Poor guy.
Mm-hmm.
And the entire show is a butt heading of idealism versus realism, and how they can both exist in the same universe so beautifully.
What do we think about that, guys?
I mean, no. One Punch Man really has straddled the line without honestly making people upset. And I've watched some of it to know that it's not a bad show. It's actually a good show.
Yep. What do you think of the idealistic versus realistic tendencies in the characters? Am I totally going off base?
If Saitama was the only character in that show, it would be boring despite its parody. Like, you could only pull one or two episodes out of that series, but thankfully he's got Genos, and he's got, the Hero League and all of those colorful characters there that
That's why Genosa exists. He is the realism to clash against the idealism and make it all pop out.
Mm-hmm.
And it really works.
Yep. Did I cut somebody off? If I did, I apologize.
You're good.
Okay. So we got a question here. Badry Bally early in the stream, or it's not so much a question, but an interesting thing he said. He said, neither idea is wrong, but realism has led to terrible works of fiction in an attempt to be realistic. And this might be another example of folks conflating realism with a negative tone. So what do we think about what Badre said here about people just trying to be so realistic that they just end up being edgy? If we can, let's either refute that, and regardless of whether or not we can refute it, let's name some examples. Sasha, what do you think?
I'm actually going to hear what other people say. I'm not really sure.
All right, David.
Hi, don't worry. I always have something to say. Whether it's relevant or not is a different question. Okay, so what happens when you try to make realism too much of something? if you have the wrong tone in the story, you can really bog things down when you suddenly try to add a huge dose of realism. If you're telling a stirring, adventurous ballad, and all of a sudden everybody stops to talk about the tax impacts of what they just did, that's probably a whiplash that your readers will not enjoy.
All right, Sazer, what do you think?
All right.
Well, addressing what he said, that's basically just genre swapping, which is technically possible, but that's a different point.
You have to be careful with that.
Yeah. Let me see. What was the question? Neither idea is wrong, but what terrible works of fiction? Well, I don't read that much fan fiction in general, so I would not be able to tell you in terms of that, in terms of story. But I can kind of see what he's getting into. Like, yeah, realism and grittiness aren't exactly one and the same. Like, look at something like Spawn or The Punisher, stuff like that. It's like not exactly realistic at all, but it is very gritty. There is a difference. Like sure. That's definitely a negative idealism, if you want to put it that way.
I would agree.
Yeah, Spawn is hard to watch just from how violent it is, and how often evil. I mean, the thing ran for 18 episodes, but how often evil came out on top in that show was just, it made it very difficult to watch.
Yet it was idealistic, just again proving that idealistic does not mean positive.
Right. Sasha, what were you going to say?
Realism. I think a lot of the times it's just people get so caught up in telling a very authentic story from a character point of view, they forget that characters still need to have justifications for what they're doing.
Yeah, and another thing that people tend to forget is that people and characters and situations are all very multifaceted, and the vast majority of people you're going to know in your life, with the exception of low functioning mental illness cases, are going to experience the full range of emotions throughout the course of a day sometimes. Depending on what situation they're in. So that's why I say it's extremely important to have realistic characters that are multifaceted and change with a situation depending on how they adapt it. When you look at something like I'm gonna say, we've already said Superman in the chat, but I'm gonna say Master Chief from the Halo series. Doesn't matter what happens. His voice never changes. Even when he's supposed to be being emotional, voice never changes, emotion never changes. Very flat character. A real person would not react to a situation like that. If nobody's got anything to say to that, I'm going to move on to the next question. We got a few. Okay, go ahead.
I do agree with you. But at the same time, it's one of those unfortunate things where the books have actually given a better in-universe, not even like excuse, but just actually showing you his background. This is him being so flat and quiet is basically became a coping mechanism for him. It wasn't even until Cortana came into the photo that he kind of started to actually voice an opinion. So for him, it's kind of like he's a hero, but the cost was his humanity.
Interesting.
So in a way, it's kind of a tragic hero story that a lot of people don't really notice because all you see is Master Chief doing crazy, badass things and saving the day, but you don't actually get to see the moments of reflection and when he's just wondering if he's actually even doing the right thing, let alone fighting the right side.
Well, can we at least agree that the helmet doesn't help?
The helmet definitely doesn't help. If they ever... I know that the whole part of the shtick is we don't get to see him, but they've even described what he looks like. So it's one of those things where I feel like if they at least let you see him, or even just turn the visor's opacity down so you could actually see the man behind the lenses, I think people would feel more for him. And the lack of emotional, tone wouldn't be such a flat delivery if you could see the feelings in his eyes. Because, you can't really repress something like that unless you're a robot.
Well, the closest they ever came was, I think it was at the end of Halo 4, and they took his helmet off, and it was an extreme close-up of his eyes. And, he looked like he hadn't slept since the first game came out in 2001. But that's all they did. That's the closest they ever got to that. Paladin Pony T asked a few questions here. The first one he asked was, do you think shows do more harm than good when they try to confront real-world issues? And in addition to that, can we give any examples of which shows did a good job of tackling real-world issues? Let's start with Sazer for this one.
Okay, which ones did a good job of addressing real issues?
And do shows usually do a good job of addressing real world issues?
I think one of the best examples from my childhood anyway is Arthur. It tackled real life situations very well for the most part. Like, some of its stories for children resonate with them very well, and I think I can only name a very select few episodes that I think kind of flopped on that front. When it comes to Magic, for example, I don't think it was quite as on point with Arthur in terms of giving very relatable, very realistic, and very thought-provoking scenarios and such. Mm-hmm. If anything, the episodes that I remember more from Friends Magic are the ones in which they try to be more real and flopped, like I said with Flutter Brother. And I know you're all gonna hate me for this, but I don't think they handled Thanks for the Memories very well. I think that was very
well, no, because if you're gonna, because they later came out and said, yeah, that was supposed to be death. Well, if it was supposed to be death, kill the tortoise.
Exactly. That's why I don't think it worked, because it just doesn't work.
I actually like that one.
I liked it too, but I got a little bit frustrated when when everybody was saying it's about death, and I'm like, well, they didn't kill the tortoise, so there's probably something else to be pulled out of here.
It doesn't have to be about death. It's about the loss of a person. They could be just as equally applied to somebody moving across country.
Yeah, but then Jim Miller went to a convention and was asked that question and said, yes, it is about death. And this
is why I never listen to what anybody says except inside the show itself. I don't pay attention to what they say on Twitter. I don't pay attention to what they say at conventions. It always ruins it every time. Every time.
Well, yeah. On a complete side tangent here, I admire Jim as a professional, but I don't think he has the best creative integrity. Like, he folds pretty easy. Anyway, David, can you give us some examples of how this might be detrimental, or what do you think about this?
Well, I brought it up once. Why don't I go ahead and bring it up again? The She-Ra show. Hooray! Hi, She-Ra.
All right. So, what real world issues do they tackle there, and how well do they do?
They actually bring up non-traditional romantic pairings really, really well.
Alrighty then.
They have characters that are straight. They have characters that are very obviously gay. They never talk about it. They never bring it up. In the world that they exist in, this is just like a normal thing. It's a perfectly idealized place where people just don't sweat about those sorts of details, and everybody's cool about it. So what if your significant other is also of the same gender as you? Nobody cares, and they pull it off without ever winking at the camera. It's kind of beautiful.
Alrighty then, that's interesting. Sasha, what do you think?
Charlie Brown actually was one of the shows that really stuck the landing hard when it came to being real. because they would only sprinkle these episodes in between all the adventure, so they wouldn't stand out unless you saw it firsthand. And for me, it has to be the episode that dealt with one of the long-standing classmates having cancer. Nobody really knew, and
I missed that episode.
She had basically been gone for months and months and months, and they even showed this episode actually took this, I think, over the span of almost a year, and it dealt with all the kids feeling kind of confused and hurt. Some even actually were like visibly upset, and Charlie Brown was the only one that thought, I hope that she's okay. Like, what can I do for her? So he actually went around and talked to the adults, even though adults don't talk. But they basically guide him through it very gently. And in a way, the show was guiding me very gently and explaining that process of fighting for your life as a child, while also kind of letting the topic hang. Even if it felt uncomfortable, the show, I always remember that Charlie Brown was never really scared to let uncomfortable moments sit on you. And I remember as a kid feeling a little bit dreadful midway through the episode because there were parts where they would let things hang. But then it got better. There was a resolution. She went into remission, and everybody was really happy. But then people were like, "But what about your hair?" And Charlie Brown's like, "That doesn't matter." And in a way, that kind of prepped me because I went through that when not at that age, but older. A classmate had gone missing for months, and nobody really knew what was going on. And she came back for a bit, went back again, and this happened for almost the whole school year until we found out she was having heart problems, and unfortunately they couldn't get a transplant in time, and she just didn't make it. And a lot of people were really, really, absolutely gutted about it because she was a great person. She wasn't involved with the school popular girl or anything like that, but everybody genuinely knew who she was, and nobody ever had a problem with her. And I had classmates crying at me, asking me why am I not crying? Well, to me, the lessons that show imparted, that episode specifically, I had already kind of processed that sadness at home and thought about it and said, because I don't think she'd want any one of us to be crying and be upset. I think she'd want people to feel glad that they ever met her and to learn from, her life and go from there. And people actually, kind of thought on that. And a bunch of my classmates and I convinced the local neighborhood to raise up money to help her family out with the funeral costs. And then we ended up dedicating a bench at the school for her. No one really sits on it. Even now, this has been, 10 plus years removed, no one sits on it out of respect because it has a placard that talks briefly about her.
So
that got deeper than I thought it was going to.
Not every cartoon pulls it off, but when they do, that is what I look for. That is what I hope that they're going to teach kids how to actually be empathetic and think about the world in a way that's understandable for them, not like an adult, but for them.
Yeah,
that's a very good example.
Yeah, that was beautiful, and I must say, when I really think about it, I think children, I don't want to come up with this overgeneralizing here, but I think more kids than we think like to be exposed to these more realistic stories because it makes them feel more grown up. But now that we are grown up, I think we're now striving to we want those idealistic shows more. It's kind of weird. It's like when you're a kid, you want to grow up faster and you're more involved in these realistic stories. But now that we're older and we realize that real life is, definitely has its downsides, we kind of want to go back to something that's more childlike and idealistic. Do you know what I'm saying?
No, of course.
Yeah,
and that type of thing is better for them too. So we're losing David here. So David, thank you so much for coming on. Give me about 30 seconds.
Absolute pleasure.
Yeah, give me 30 seconds here because we got one more question. Trent Jerome says, cold brew, everyone, yay or nay? Let me get your answer to that, David.
Drink coffee.
All right, that's all we need to know then. You have a great night. Thank you for coming on.
Take it easy, everybody.
SazerLite cold brew, yay or nay? You there?
Who, me?
Yeah, SazerLite cold brew, yay or nay?
I thought I don't drink soda at all.
All right.
Coffee. He's talking about cold brew coffee.
Oh, I don't drink coffee either. I don't drink tea.
I actually do like.
I think he's referring to beer actually.
Well, I don't drink beer either.
Well,
Whether
that's
beer or
good.
coffee or liquor, the answer is yes.
I'll take some sweet tea. But that was
cold brew tea is really nice.
Yeah. Especially you squeeze some you brew it with some you squeeze a lemon in there and dump half a jar of honey. Good stuff.
Indeed, actually.
Yep.
Let it sit and stir.
Yep. And with that, I'm going to call it there. I think that was a good conversation. What do you guys think?
For sure. No complaints here. It's always nice being able to sit down and talk with you guys about honestly anything, and I'm happy that people related and felt good about this and gave in their thoughts. It's always nice. I've been following the chat here.
Yeah, I saw some interesting conversations going on in there. But yeah, thanks everybody for coming out. Thank you, Sasha, for being on the stream. Thank you, SazerLite, for suggesting the topic. Another thank you to David, even though he can't hear us right now. And everybody who watched, I hope you had fun and learned something as well. So right from there, yeah, I think that's good. So if you want to see more streams from me, next Friday is going to be Friday Night Fights, where we take a video game, we play it tomorrow night on Princess Heather Blossom's channel at 10 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're going to be crocheting, and I'm going to be reading the chat there, so you can come and hang out. If you want to be on this show, I would love to have you. We just got to get you on the Patreon for as little as $1 a month, and from there you can make suggestions for topics, as well as suggest games that you'd like to see us play, and you can get on the show as well. Big thanks to my $10 and up people. These guys are Princess Heather Blossom, Shady Oak Ministry, Sid McConroy, Autoknight, Emerald Spencer, Sodden, Girder, Senko, Jennan, Kellogg, Kyle Christensen, DJ Skywalker, Stephen A. Wilson, Reck, the Equestrian City Heroverse series, and Rein-Kun. Thank you all for your support, and have a great night. God bless and stay safe out there, everyone.
Have a good night, everyone. Thank you so much for having us.
See you guys later.